Chief Executive of the Free Speech Union, and it's a pleasure to invite each of you here tonight who are joining us live at the St. David's Theatre at Otago University. For those that are joining on our social media or on Sky Channel 83 on our online platform, or joining on the platform, the radio station. At the Free Speech Union, we firmly believe in the value and importance of debate, where the truth is found through openly weighing and testing ideas. Yet New Zealanders feel more and more that they are unable to have this debate, or hear competing opinions in an increasingly segregated environment. During recent polling that the Free Speech Union conducted, 75% of Kiwis said that free speech is a dominant cultural value to what it means to be a New Zealander. Yet that same community, a majority, said that they feel that free speech is under threat. Decades ago, Lady Bird Johnson, the First Lady of the United States, claimed that the clash of ideas is the sound of freedom. We at the Free Speech Union still believe this today. And that may sound like a largely uncontroversial claim to make at a place like this, at a university. Yet according to the 2023 Academic Freedom Survey that we release annually, across all 8 universities in New Zealand, only 46% of academics felt that they were free to question received wisdom and state controversial or unpopular ideas. Claims that those who were more senior and therefore supposedly more secure in their roles, such as professors, claims that they were freer to speak on controversial subjects did not play out. In fact, only 31% of professors agreed that they were free to state controversial or unpopular opinions. If those who have dedicated their careers to exploring specific subjects, if they are the ones who feel unfree to voice their views, if they are unpopular or controversial, how can these conversations move forward? That is the perennial question I believe we must answer. Popular and uncontroversial perspectives are simply not going to cut it. And that's why, inspired by events such as the Monk Debates, the Free Speech Union New Zealand has organised a 4-part series over the next 6 weeks, where the principle of free speech can be practised through the exchange of differing thoughts and perspectives. I got off a flight from New York very early this morning and came straight down here to spend this evening with you lovely people. So with the help of more than 1 or 2 espressos, I'll work hard to try and keep the caffeine jitters to a minimum and this debate on track. Of course, in the United States, they are entering the debate season as well, with the first presidential primary debates starting next week. It raises the age-old question, what's the difference between an argument in kindergarten and the presidential debate? The answer used to be 60 years, but with the lot that they have over there now, it's more like 80 years. Tonight we have some younger and still experienced debates. But it's not just these debaters that we'll be hearing from tonight. Tonight we are pleased to invite you to have your say as well. Importantly, both for our live audience and those joining us via television or radio or online streaming, you too can participate. On your screens and above me here, you can see a QR code. If you take your phones out and place it on the camera mode and scan this QR code, you will be prompted to participate in 2 questions that will come up. The first is whether you agree or disagree with tonight's moot, that the government should lead in the fight to reach net zero. Also the second question, whether you are willing to change your mind. We believe in persuasion and the exchange of ideas to move conversations forward. So I hope all those who are listening are willing to participate in this exchange. Tonight we are interested not only in the quality of the ideas that we hear, but the impact that they have, how persuasive they are. At the end of tonight's debate, we will ask you to complete the first question again, to test whose minds have changed. The winner of tonight's debate will not be those with the strongest support, but those who have changed the most minds. Now to the substance of our debate. July 2023 was the hottest month ever recorded. The United Nations claimed that we have gone beyond a climate crisis and have reached the point of global boiling. Speaking against vapid virtue signalling, we are told that the atmosphere responds to outcomes, not announcements. But putting aside the fact that similarly catastrophic predictions have been made by the United Nations previously and yet have not eventuated, the claim that the atmosphere responds to outcomes, not announcements, does not answer the question of who should drive these outcomes. Tonight we launch our 2023 debate series with the moot, be it resolve. Governments should lead the fight to reach net zero. Unfortunately, while originally we had 4 debaters accept our invitation to address this question through several unexpected last-minute disruptions, like Parliament going into urgency, so we can take that up with the government, neither ACT MP Simon Court nor climate activist Rosemary Penny-Warden, for another reason, are able to join us on the stage tonight. But despite their absence, we have the following 2 fantastic speakers. Arguing the affirmative, James Cockle is claiming that the government should lead the fight to reach net zero. He is a veteran climate activist and Dunedin local. In 2021, James made national news by challenging the other veteran climate activist, James Shaw that is, not a Dunedin local, for the co-leadership position of the Green Party. Unsuccessful in that enterprise, he has gone on to make more national news by gluing himself in a bid to draw to highways in a bid to draw attention to climate change. And we'll be looking forward to hearing from him tonight. Arguing the negative, that the government should not lead the fight to reach net zero, and probably should not lead the fight in anything else at all, I would imagine, is Damien Grant, a man described as a notoriously flagrant white cis male. I'll let you take from that what it should. He is a business owner, a libertarian, and a long-standing regular stuff columnist. In April this year, Damien wrote a column entitled, "We're having a free speech moment. It's not going well," in which he claimed, "We no longer engage in debate, but a tit-for-tat escalation of tactical moves to deny those we disagree with the opportunity to be heard or to punish them if they speak out of turn." We are pleased that both James and Damien are able to join us this evening to put to bed this claim that we are no longer able to debate. And to start off our discussion this evening, we will hear from James Cockle, speaking in the affirmative for 10 minutes. The floor is yours, James.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, of course. Governments should lead the charge to net zero. In fact, they need to go much, much further than that. Over the next few minutes, I want to explain 3 things. 1, the situation is probably worse than you realise. 2, governments set the rules and have the resources to make big changes. Therefore, they must be the first to take action. And 3, governments are failing to take action, and therefore you need to participate in a foundational aspect of our democracy. And I'll explain what that means at the end. First, the context in which this debate is happening. The situation is worse than you probably think. Climate-charged extreme weather events are devastating our crop growers and farmers and people all over the world. In New Zealand, we saw record levels of rainfall, flooding in Auckland and Northland, Cyclone Gabriel. What does this actually mean? It means people have died, crops have failed, whole farms and orchards are under thick layers of silt. Have any of you tried to buy a kumara lately? $12 a pack and save at the moment. Why? Because the record rainfall in Northland decimated the crops this year. Canada on fire, New York shrouded in smoke, Hawaii on fire with people jumping into the sea to try to escape. Last year, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater. Climate change is here now. The best available science has laid out why it is happening, and we know what we need to do about it. I need to be very clear. This is just the beginning. The effects of climate change are not linear. They are not a new normal. They are the beginning of collapse. The doubling of extreme weather events will more than double the damage. So what's next? Well, on our current trajectory, we are set to pass 1.5, 2 and 3 degrees of warming, according to climateactiontracker.org. At 1.5 degrees, low-lying Pacific nations who have contributed the least to climate change, nations such as Tuvalu and Kiribati, will be condemned to shifting coastlines due to sea level rise, with swathes of their land becoming uninhabitable. People will lose not only their homes, but their homeland. On our current trajectory, we only have a 5% chance of avoiding 2 degrees of warming. If you knew there was a 5% chance of the plane you were getting on landing safely, I bet you wouldn't get on it. Can you imagine what 2 degrees of warming will look like? At 2 degrees, 800 million to 3 billion people are projected to experience chronic water scarcity due to droughts. At 2 degrees, heat waves in the tropics get longer, lasting 3 months, up to 3 months. This turns arable land into desert and livable cities into extreme heat zones. Now, I came here in good faith, and I trust my opponent is not going to waste my time and yours by disputing the best available science or suggesting in any way that urgent action is not required. So why am I telling you this? Because you need to understand the situation we're in. Why is it that in everyday life we walk around and nobody seems to be panicking? On the news, we hear stories about the financial hit tourist operators are facing due to the fact that roads have been destroyed by extreme severe weather events, without once joining the dots, without mentioning that the international flights that the tourism operators rely on are contributing to the devastation. Then we cut to the ads. Ads for fast cars, cheap flights, holidays around the world, fast food full of meat and dairy. We are living in a state of denial. A shared delusion that everything is okay, but we know that it isn't. It's very tempting and easy to conclude that governments should not lead the fight towards net zero when one examines their catastrophic failure to deal with the issue so far. We've known about climate change a long time, and since the 1990s, when governments around the world got together and promised to reduce emissions and take this issue seriously, since then, globally, we have produced more man-made greenhouse gas emissions than since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and probably more than the rest of human history combined. I can see how you might feel justified in arguing that governments around the world have had their chance and failed, and so now it is time to let the private sector take over. This would be a grave mistake, because the failure of our governments is directly related to how subservient they are to big money interests. The gap between the rich and poor is bigger than ever, and we know that lobbyists for big, powerful industries freely wander the halls of power. Big money donors get special access to our politicians. Trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement allow mega businesses to sue our government in international courts, which results in a chilling, invisible hand directing the government away from regulation that would be in our best interests. Our governments have betrayed us, betrayed our Pacific Island brothers and sisters who now face climate genocide. They have betrayed us by protecting private industry. They have allowed our agricultural sector to avoid paying for their emissions. They continue to underprice the emissions trading scheme, which the government's own productivity commission recommended would need to be at around $200 to $250 a tonne to achieve net zero. Industries such as aviation, automobile and agriculture all talk of reducing emissions and are working on the next big breakthrough that will save us, whether it be genetically engineered crops or cows, seaweed feeds, electric or biofuel planes, electric or hydrogen trucks and cars in our roads. Let's be clear. This is a lie. This is greenwash used for the purpose of predatory delay. It is a new tactic to achieve the same goal: delay change and keep making profits. First, they denied climate change was an issue when they knew it was real. American oil giant ExxonMobil did this after their own scientists told them they were causing climate change. So they hired fringe scientists to argue against climate change on TV to try and frame the debate as two-sided. They knew they couldn't win, but they didn't need to. All they needed to do was sow enough doubt in the public's mind that they would convince them not to take action. Now, we all know about the carbon footprint, right? This was invented by British Petroleum, BP. They invented the concept of the carbon footprint to try and convince you that your emissions are your fault. They knew it would not last, They knew that people would get wise to this once they learned about it, and once they learned that just 100 corporations produce 70% of all the emissions. But it bought them time enough to continue to extract and burn the oil. Now, they use fake fantasy solutions to continue the delay. They know we don't have the carbon budget to build enough EVs to replace all our cars. We don't have the renewable energy to power them. We can't grow the solar and wind to a level that can replace our current usage of energy, let alone account for the projected growth. They know full well we can't grow enough crops to power transportation with biofuel, and that trying to do so will create severe food shortages. They know that the dairy herd cannot stay the size it is without destroying our rivers. They know their greenwash is a lie, but they don't need it to work. They just need you to believe them for long enough to continue to mine and burn the oil, coal and gas and keep the profits flowing. The reality of the situation is this: the only way we can reduce emissions to net zero and below is to radically reduce what we consume and allow the natural world to recover. To do this, the government must be involved. Now, detractors will tell you that I want you to suffer. They'll tell you that I want to keep the world's poor poor. Nothing could be further from the truth. The rich and powerful want you to believe this because they want you to accept that they can continue to mine and burn and kill in the name of progress. We can reduce poverty, provide housing and food, and reduce the excesses of the mega-rich while taking good care of our planet and fulfilling our obligations to future generations. We can reduce emissions and reduce consumption by sharing what we have so that everybody can live well. Or we can wait for the inevitable collapse of our civilization. I wish I could tell you that the government was doing a good job, but clearly they're failing us. And this is despite years and years of pressure by the public to encourage them to take the actions they have promised and to keep us safe from the devastating effects of climate change. For years, people have been signing petitions, going on marches, blocking coal mines and coal trains, writing letters to their MPs, occupying precious natural spaces to protect them from the bulldozers. But despite all these efforts, things have continued getting worse for the natural world on which we depend for our survival. In 2019, 170,000 school kids marched on our streets. Our politicians joined them and congratulated them, then went back into their offices and continued business as usual, and we watched as the planet burned. Our government's failure to take action constitutes a betrayal of the highest order. They are knowingly and willingly leading us into a future of geopolitical instability, societal collapse and starvation. Our military is right now seeking to form closer alliances with our allies and increase combat capability because of the risks to national security posed by climate change, according to a recent RNZ report. However, the government is the only body capable of leading the charge to achieve net zero. They have the resources to enact large-scale change, such as genuinely regenerative agriculture, such as free public transport and nationwide rail. They are also the ones who set the rules for how businesses and individuals operate. The government can and must incentivise the use of genuine, proven alternatives in transport, energy and agriculture. But none of this will happen unless we take action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. The debate is off to a roaring start. I can see heads nodding. I can see heads shaking. I think this is the debate, the clash of ideas that we wanted. Damien, 10 minutes to you now.
I think the only head shaking was mine. But James, given the condemnation that you have just delivered to government, I will be sending you your membership card for the Libertarian Society shortly. But the election season hasn't even started, and already politicians are breaking promises. I was meant to be second fiddle to Simon Court from the ACT Party, and then he sent me a text a couple of hours ago throwing me into the lion's den. So thank you, Simon. And I think it's just another example of why you cannot and why you should not, James, never trust a politician. But I want to give you another example, and that's the person who should have been joining you on the stage, Rosemary Penwarden. What has happened to Rosemary is just a disgrace. For those of you who are unaware, Rosemary sent a clearly provocative funny, entertaining spoof letter attempting to or pretending to cancel a gas industry conference. Nobody would have received that letter and seriously believed that this was a genuine attempt to cancel it. And the local authorities, the police, in my opinion, utterly shamefully prosecuted this woman. This was a violation of free speech. The police and the prosecution failed in their primary responsibility, and the jurors who convicted them, well, absolutely shame on them. And I bring this up not because I am genuinely outraged as what has happened to Rosemary Penn-Warden. I think that is a chilling thing that has happened to an activist. I don't agree with her views, but I absolutely stand with her right to express her views and to do so free of criminal prosecution. But it's instructive and it's illustrative of what I want to talk about here today, and that is where, if we are going to get to net zero, how do we get there? And what are the institutions and the mechanisms that we use to get there? And what I am going to propose is that we do not hand power to the organisations that will prosecute somebody like Rosemary Penn-Warden for speaking and saying things that the state, the people in power, the people you have so rightly condemned, James, are critical of. I want to start, so let's talk about the science in a little bit. So where did the science come from? And it actually comes from a remarkable gentleman called Charles Keeling. Now, the idea about CO2 in the atmosphere had kind of been around, but in 1958, Charles Keeling goes to, well, I think he lived in the Big Island in Hawaii, and he started to measure the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And when he started, it was a bit over 300 parts per million, and that was in 1958. A couple of years ago, it breached 400 parts per million. It's now about 412 or 420 parts per million CO2. Now, I want to talk about that and a couple of things. The first thing is, I will admit, a shocking degree of ignorance. I don't really know what a carbon molecule is, I'll be honest. I don't know what carbon dioxide is. I understand at a very high level conceptual idea. You've got C and two O's and they come together. But you're telling me, or I'm being told, and I'm listening to the science, and I'm listening to Charles Keeling, and I'm saying we've gone from 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million. Put that into perspective. If every New Zealander was an atmospheric molecule, we've gone from about 1,500 to 2,000. That's a tiny increase. It's a number so small that not even Winston Peters will get exercised about. I do not understand how that extra 500 is influencing the climate. I am very confident I could spend a decade and still not understand. I don't understand how Ashford works either, but I know that it does. I don't understand how my microwave oven works, but it does. I don't need to understand how things work. I need to understand, I need to believe, and I need to accept in the scientific process, something partly developed by Karl Popper just up the road here in Canterbury. And the integrity of the scientific process is so critically important to, if we are going to achieve net zero, we are going to need to take a lot of sceptical people with us. And one of the things I want to talk about is some of the approaches that have been talked about. We are going to lose a lot of people along the way. And when I talk about, you're talking about 500 parts per million, right? When you start talking about, well, how does that work? It doesn't take a lot. If you want to disbelieve climate science, there is a vast array of resources for you to disbelieve. And the one thing we need to do is not give them a reason to go looking. And that's important. Let's also talk about the challenges we in New Zealand face. Let's talk about China. China is the real elephant in the room. 1945, looking at up parts per million, or they're talking about the carbon footprint, it was pretty close to zero. By 1980, it's about 1.5 tonnes of CO2 per individual. 2000, it's 3, 2010, it's 4, 2020, they're talking about 8 tonnes of CO2 per person. Not much different from our own. Our contribution is minuscule. We don't have the power to change what is going to happen, but we do have the power to lead. And we have led before. New Zealand has a proud history in a number of areas. Particularly, we like to think about women's suffrage, but it's not only in women's suffrage. I know a lot of people here probably aren't that keen about the 1984 reforms, but a lot of what we did there had world-leading impacts. Some of the stuff we've done on welfare has led the world. We have the power to set an example, and that is really important. So what are the 4 things that I think we need to focus on? 1, from a global perspective, we're irrelevant. 2, we're going to have to confront the adaptation mitigation reality. Whether we adapt, whether we change our behaviour or not, we're going to have to deal with climate events. We need to have the capital and the resources to respond so our economy and our people are not impacted. The rains that hit Auckland earlier this year had an incredibly low mortality rate, and they had an incredibly low mortality rate because Auckland is a first world city. Now, sure, some of the culverts failed and some of the drains failed, but if that level of rain had happened in other parts of the world, the death toll would have been in the hundreds or the thousands. Maintaining our standard of living is critical for our people. We can lead, and I think that's really important, and that's what I'm going to really focus on today. We can set an example. We can lead. But the other thing is we must remain solvent, and maybe that's from my day job I focus on solvency, but for us we need to be able to pay our way in the world. And so the moot is, should the government lead? And my proposition is no, but the government should set the rules of the game. And the example I like to use is you think about the Companies Act, you think about limited liability companies, you think about the rules of contract. All of those things, the government doesn't get involved and tell people how you should run your business in terms of what your profit margin should be or what your marketing budget should do. What the government does at a very high level, it says if you want to run a business in New Zealand, here's the rules of the game. And beyond that, off you go. Some businesses succeed, make a lot of money, some fail, whatever. In the emissions trading scheme, we have a comparable regime, is my proposition to you. The government says, if you want to be in the business of producing carbon, here are the rules. Here is what, if you produce carbon, this is how, I'm not even going to tell you what the price is. They are simply going to say, if we want to get to net zero by 2050, which is our commitment under the Paris Climate Accord, here is the rules of the game. And then every single one of us gets to make the decision about what we want to do and our part in getting there. If, for example, you have a coal burner or you are using coal, the emission trading scheme, the price of carbon, around $50-60, almost doubles the cost of using coal. Creates a huge incentive to get out of coal. But if you're driving a car, it's about 5 or 10%. At the margin, some people will not use the car. Some businesses who find enormous value will. By setting the rules of the game, the government can encourage us to make our own micro decisions about how we get there.
Very good. We want to open the floor up for questions shortly, but before we do that, a chance to respond to the opening comments for the two debaters. So, James, you have 5 minutes to respond to Damien's comments here, Damien likewise, and then we'll make sure you all can have a say as well.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think first of all, I'd like to say that we need to get past this idea that we're too small and that what we do doesn't matter. I agree with what Damien said, that we can be world leaders and we can show what can be done. But if we think that what we do doesn't matter because we're too small, then if you were to take a country like China and divide it up into 1,000 small countries, then nothing that any of them did would matter either. So I think we need to really just move past that concept. We hear it a lot in the media. I think every time you hear it, remember, it's not true. We are producing high emissions per capita as a nation. And also the products that we import from China, because we've decimated our own manufacturing in this country, they're not counted on our balance sheets. They're not counted on our nationally determined contribution. So we need to start to account for those things. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the adaptation and mitigation. Yes, we do need to adapt, and the best way that we can do that is by reducing our consumption. If we reduce the consumption of the natural resources that we rely on, that means when shocks happen, we're far more resilient to those things. So that's the way we need to do this. We can do that, and we can improve our overall standard of living as well. It doesn't mean going without, except for the excesses of wealth, the frivolous expenses that are not needed. You know, these billionaires with private jets, that needs to stop. CO2 is 1 carbon to 2 oxygen. So what CO2 emissions represent is theft from you. When we burn hydrocarbons, 1 carbon from the thing that you're burning joins with 2 oxygens from the air. So you're stealing oxygen out of the air when you're burning that. It's a change in thinking that we need. And when we talk about being solvent, remaining solvent, that is problematic because the world is bigger than the economy. And so if we are going to be constrained within an economic lens, that may mean that we are not able to solve these problems. So we need to take our thinking outside of the economic lens in order to solve these and acknowledge and understand that the economy is a subset of the world that we live in, and none of it happens, none of it exists without that wider world. The externalization of costs is the way that businesses within the economy take from you and me and the rest of us. Externalizing costs to the natural world, it's one of the things that has to change. And it's not on anybody's balance sheet. It's the way we can pollute our rivers, pollute our air, cut down our trees, and all those things. We need to change our way of thinking about these things. And that might mean seeing the world as a living entity. And I want to put that out to you as a people call people like me crazy when we say things like that. But if it's what we need to do to change how we think, then that's what we need to do in order to continue to survive on this world. In terms of the price on carbon, if we continue with business as usual, then it will continue to be underpriced. And currently I think there is actually an upper limit that is set by the government. I think it's about $70, $80 at the moment. So they have sort of an escape clause. It's not really a free market. They have an escape clause that means that if the price gets too high, they will sell them at that upper limit. And they can control what that upper limit is. They've chosen not to increase the upper limit this year. So they've chosen to underprice carbon this year. And that's me, thanks.
So I just want to pick up on one thing you said, that the billionaires and their private jets. Now, I don't have a private jet, sadly, I've never been on one. But whether or not a billionaire uses a private jet is a subjective value judgment. And at the moment, we might think, well, I'm not a billionaire, and I don't have a private jet. But I want to take you to something that the Climate Commission has got on their website. I want you to think about what they're saying in the light of the comment about private jets. Transitioning to a low-emission ATRO in New Zealand will mean changes to the way energy is produced, the way people travel, the way the communities they live in and the way land is used. They are talking that the language is the language of control. There is a desire, if you think that the control of carbon is an existential risk, then by all means you have a right to stop the billionaire driving in that jet. But at some point they have a right, those people in that position of power, if we grant them that power, they have the right to go and see your grandson is frivolous. Why are you seeing your grandson? At some point we were told, go and seeing your dying parent is not something for the common good and not to be allowed. Now, a lot of us maybe agreed with that particular policy, but this is when you say that something is an existential risk, we hand power over to those people who are going to make subjective decisions about our lives. And when we look at the alternative, and the alternative is the emissions trading scheme, and you're right, James, when you talk about it's not a free market, because the government keeps meddling. The government keeps issuing these NEUs. If the price gets too high, the government gets a bit jittery, and so they release some to keep the cost down. The government should just set the emission trading scheme, set the target, and let it go. If that is the process, if we establish that as a regime, and we say, right, and maybe the price is $200, maybe that's the price. But the thing is that those people who are able to easily and quickly convert from coal to solar, who say, well, okay, I want to go to the Batch this year, but maybe I don't need to go to Gisborne, whatever it is, well, at the margin, we will collectively make decisions. We don't need to pay $140 million to an Australian-listed entity to change a coal burner, because they will do it on their own. Just consider that. That was about 10% of the Farm Act bill paid to an Australian entity because somebody made a subjective decision about what was important. If we don't do that and we say, okay, we know we have to reduce the carbon, and for those of us who are producing a lot of carbon, we have to pay a lot of money to keep doing it. And if we're producing that carbon to make capsicums, which we're selling for $400 a kilo, we'll keep doing it. If we're using it to produce something that's a margin we could swap out to solar, we will do that. We will get to where we need to get to without having to hand our lives over to commissars. And I just want to talk about China. The one thing that we can do that is more powerful than anything else, we gave women the vote and the world didn't end. If we introduce and we make the emissions trading scheme in New Zealand work, we stop with the government interfering, we let the market price sit wherever it is. The Chinese will sit there and they will look at that and says, cripes, those canny Kiwis, they're pretty good. If they can make the boat go faster, and they haven't tanked their economy, and the occasional billionaire can still use his yacht, and people are making subjective decisions at the margins about their own lives, and they're on path to get to net zero by 2050 in a way that we are not handing out the power of our lives over to bureaucrats. We don't have to rely on people like James valiantly engaging in the sort of activity that you want. If we are relying on people destroying paintings and gluing themselves to the road as a means by which to change behaviour, it's not going to work. The best way to change people's behaviour is to give them a simple incentive to do it. That's my proposition.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. James, I wonder if you're happy, would you like to address just quickly that question that Damien raises before we open up the floor wider in terms of control? It is a comment that is often made that what this is really is an overreach that is going beyond perhaps the argument that you're making. What would your response to that be?
Thank you for asking. I would say that with Damien's proposition here that these value judgments are subjective, I disagree. They're objective. And I think that what they do, what your proposition does, Damien, is it takes away the values that we have as a society. And what it does is it regards every product and every commodity as of equal value, based on the subjective decision made by each individual. And I don't think that is correct. I don't think that's how things should be, because the products and commodities that we have are there for a purpose. A house is there for people to live in. It's not there to be a commodity bought and sold and traded for someone to grow their wealth with. And if we see steel as a really good example of something that is a commodity that takes a lot of coal and a lot of CO2 to produce, well, what are we using that steel for? It matters. The steel being wasted to build trusses in people's sheds is not an appropriate use for that steel as a society. But the steel that's needed to create a spade, to dig a hole, to plant a tree, that is a valuable use of that steel. So we need to bring our values as a society to the commodities and the products that we have, and not just regard them as just a value judgment that anybody can make, and those with more money can just choose to plunder and waste our resources. That I completely disagree with.
How do you know what people are going to use the spade for? I mean, you dig a spade to grow a tree, and that's a tick. And then you use it to grow something that's socially unacceptable, like, I don't know, marijuana.
Well,
I mean, come on, man.
It's a matter of scale, isn't it? A spade is a useful commodity that can be used for that purpose.
A spade is a spade.
A steel truss being used when wood is available instead to build houses with, it's the wrong use for that product, and that we need to be able to bring our values to this.
Come on, James. I want to get some steel to build a trust, but I'm doing this for a shed where I'm going to store my quad bike and my jet boat, and I'm going to need a government a tech from Rod Carr that I can do that, as opposed to I'm going to have a trust where I'm going to have a shed for my lambs. And I think. Because what you're talking about is implementing a regime of political control that is just, that you talk about our values, right? We talk about our values. And one of the values that I think New Zealanders hold dear, or certainly I hold dear, is I made the decision to come here. Right? I said, all right, I'm going to come to Dunedin. I haven't been to Dunedin for a while. It's lovely. I saw the thing with Robbie Burns. I think it's great. Tomorrow I'm going up to Christchurch to talk to some people out there. I didn't... Now, was that frivolous? Is coming to this event, burning up the carbon miles, was that a frivolous thing to do? Maybe yes, maybe no. If we're going through your metric, the logical, rational endpoint is that I should have say, okay, I'm going to use some carbon to go from A to B. Is that an appropriate, socially useful thing for me to be doing? And if the answer is no, because I'm coming to Dunedin for a bit of a jaunt, then the answer is no, that's not. But if I'm coming here for a valuable business purpose, then the answer is yes. You're talking, say, building a shed for an appropriate mechanism. I don't think that's right, James.
This is what we're here for. Damien, I'm going to come to you first. We'll raise a few questions we have here before going to the floor, and of course those of you online are also welcome to participate. Damien, a traditional libertarian view claims that a central role of the government is at the very least to defend the nation state from threats, foreign and domestic. Given that we've said we accept the science as it stands, despite perhaps not understanding the science fully, and that there is a significant threat related to climate change, how would it not be a dereliction of the basic purpose of government to lead from a defensive perspective in countering climate change from a libertarian perspective?
The way to look at carbon from a libertarian perspective is that there are some things that are a market failure, and pollution is a classic market failure. The tragedy of the commons is a market failure. If you find yourself sitting in your car for, I assume you have traffic jams in Dunedin, we certainly had them in Auckland. I'll sit in my car for 30, 40 minutes to go 20 kilometres. That's a market failure, and it's a market failure because the government builds the roads and then has no constraint onto who or when you can use it. So you're free to use the roads, you just have to, you pay with your time. And the market failure here is, you're right, James, when you talk about stealing oxygen if I am putting out carbon, I am potentially creating negative environmental effects. I'm creating pollution that other people get caught up with. And so the market failure is that there is no price mechanism for that. The emission trading scheme is not a perfect market solution. The perfect market solution would be to somehow sell the air. You think about overfishing in a private lake. You don't get overfishing in a private lake because somebody owns a lake and they can control it. Well, you can't really do that with the atmosphere. And so the emissions trading scheme is kind of a backdoor mechanism to deal with that.
I'm going to hold you to that question a little bit more because I'm not sure that's exactly a thorough answer. What we're talking about are refugees arriving from Pacific Islands that have been swamped, provision of electricity failing, healthcare services, society stopping functioning according to the claims of climate activists. Really, it's a market failure question that if we just had the emission trading scheme operating properly, this would all be set.
Well, no. If we had the emission trading scheme in New Zealand, it would make no difference. We could reduce ourselves.
So, with that in mind, then, from a libertarian perspective, wouldn't it be fair for the government then to have to take a more active role?
No, because what I'm saying is, if we want to get to net zero by 2050, there are a number of ways that we can do it, and I guess there are two competing versions here. So I've got as close as I can realistically get to a free market solution, which is to say we're going to put a price on carbon, and if you want to use carbon, you've got to pay because carbon is a pollutant. And James's solution is, okay, we're not going to do that. We are going to say, okay, if you're doing stuff that involves carbon, we are going to control and regulate the way that you do that, right? So there are essentially two competing ways out of it, and so. From my perspective, well, not just as a libertarian, I think even if I wasn't a libertarian, I would say, what is the best way that we can improve the climate? And my view is twofold. One, what we do in New Zealand in terms of the impact of the climate is meaningless, but what we do in New Zealand, that sets the template for other countries to follow. If we do it here and it fails, okay, makes no difference. If we do it here and it works, people are going to copy it. And that, I think, is the message. We have historically been, we have experimented. We experimented with the welfare state, much to my chagrin, but we did. We experimented with giving women the vote. We experimented with an independent central bank. Some of our experiments failed and they weren't copied. Some of our experiments did work and they were copied. If the emissions trading scheme works, people copy it, we can save the planet. Wouldn't that be great?
James, the basic premise of your introduction, based on my understanding, correct me if I was wrong, was that the immediate threat, the significance of the catastrophe that we are staring down is what justifies the right for the government at the mandate of society to intervene in such a drastic way. Harvard biologist George Wald said concerning environmental damage that civilization will end within 15 to 30 years unless immediate action is taken. However, that was in 1970. Your premise claims that the immediacy of the crisis is what justifies government intervention to the degree that you're arguing for. Yet claims have been made regarding climate change for decades now that have not come true. Why should you be justified to have such intervention at this stage?
It's not about the immediacy of the crisis, it's about the catastrophe of the scale of the catastrophe that we're facing. It might be 10, 15 years, it might be 100 years, but humans have been on this earth for 300,000 years.
Everyday people are not inclined towards taking the actions that you claim are necessary. I think as part of your premise that we need the government to be involved in order to justify that intervention. Yet New Zealand does operate as a democracy, and there needs to be a public mandate for actions of the government. How can the government lead in the fight to reach net zero without first getting its citizens and commerce on board? And if they have been gotten on board, why are individuals then not the best actors sectors if they have been convinced and persuaded, rather than government superimposing that on them?
Great question. 2 reasons. So first up, the government doesn't... I'm so sorry. First up, the government does not need to get a mandate. They already have a mandate. They were swept into power for the first time under MMP. The government was swept into power, over 50%. And what did they promise? They promised to tackle climate change, build houses, and solve poverty. So they've got the mandate already to do it, but they're not doing it. Why aren't they doing it? Because they don't work for you and me. And that's why the action that we take is necessary. That's why we must exercise a fundamental part of a functioning democracy, which is to take disruptive action. Now, sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, I'm just going to return to the first part of your answer there, actually, because you're saying that a Labour government with a majority mandate already has the public bought in to the necessary involvement here to such an extent. The basic premise of my question, though, is if that is true, why are the actions of everyday Kiwis not enough where they get to self-regulate and choose how they believe in what you're saying? They're buying what you're selling.
Thank you. Yes.
So why are those actions not enough then? Or why do we need a superstructure of a monolithic state to impose themselves in the lives of everyday Kiwis?
We already have a monolithic state that's imposing itself on the lives of ordinary Kiwis, and it's making decisions that make it impossible for you to avoid participating in your own demise. That's why we have a government that is hell-bent on building roads to the exclusion of public transport, which means that you need to get into your car to get around, that you need to be stuck in that Auckland traffic to get to work every day. And I can tell you, if we were to remove that requirement, I don't think people would be... If people didn't have to sit 2 hours a day in traffic to get to work and back, I don't think people would be screaming, "Let me out of this hellhole." If they had functioning public transport that actually worked, if we had a rail network across this country that meant that you didn't need to get on a plane to come to visit different parts of the country, you could get on a train to get there instead. And you could work on your laptop and you could take calls and you could do other things, you could sleep on them. People would have options, but we don't have those options. The monolithic state, which is working for big money interest, is forcing you to participate in your own demise. That's the situation we're in, and that's why we need to take action. That's why individuals are not able to take those choices that you're talking about.
So why do you trust them? I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. We have a great big monolithic state that is captured by lobbyists and crony capitalists. I mean, the money that went to BlueScope was just an abomination. 10% of the Farm Act bill. We cannot trust the government, James. Join me. We want to put... James is right in so many ways, right? But what he is saying is that the state is captured. And believe me, I've been in the room. It is so easy to capture a politician. If we go to a system where you talk about sitting in traffic, right? So we say, okay, if you go from A to B and it costs you $7 of petrol, or it costs you $13 in petrol, some people will keep going, but at the margin, some people will say, you know what? I think I'd rather live closer into town because of that extra difference in petrol prices. And as people at the margin do that, then the value of inner city living goes up. Not a lot, but it goes up just enough. And that little bit more means the developer says, oh, the inner city apartments are now worth an extra 7%. So all of a sudden, I'll actually build a bit of density there. And all the way along, there's thousands of individual micro decisions at the margin will get there. But instead, what we have is the government says, oh, Mr. Musk, I tell you what, you're such a cool guy. If you sell one of your cars in New Zealand, we're going to give the person that buys it $8,000. Now, at the margin, what does that do for carbon emissions? 4/5 of 5/8 of nothing, because if we have the emission trading scheme, the carbon that comes off from the use of that car effectively gets reallocated somewhere else. That $8,000 could have been used on so much more, and it doesn't change anything in terms of the total carbon emissions if we have a functioning ETS. Don't trust the state, James. Come with me. Come on.
I have to say, I agree that market forces do have a role to play. You know, in your example where people can make different choices, that's great. But unless the government steps in and provides cost-effective alternatives, then people aren't actually given the option to change. All they're being done is hung out to dry. All they're being done is being cast aside and left out of the system. They're being left out of our society. And that's what we've seen already too much in the last 30 years in our country. So what we need is a government that, yes, it does allow some market forces to play a part in what's happening, but it also provides a stability and provides options for people so that they can get on that bus instead, so that they can make those other changes. And what you're suggesting with the libertarian approach is you're saying that you can purchase the air that I don't want to sell. You can purchase the carbon credits that I don't want to sell, but I don't have the right to refuse your sale. You can just take them.
So run that past me again.
Well, your ETS example, you're saying you increase the price. So if you've got the money, you can do it. If you've got the money, you can do what you want. You know?
Yes.
What I'm saying is that we need to provide for everybody.
Yes and no. But imagine you're a capsicum grower, and you've got a coal burner that's churning through. You might be a very big, very successful capsicum grower, and you're churning through millions of dollars of capsicum. And at the margin, that if there's no ETS, there's no price on carbon, then you can run your gas burner, your coal burner, and you're pumping out all this carbon. And that carbon, everybody else has to pay for. But what we're saying is, hold on, there's a cost of putting that carbon out there, Mr. Capsicum Grower. And we get bang, all right. So now the cost of that coal burner goes from $100,000 to $400,000. Now, if the value of the capsicums are high enough, he'll keep going. But let's say there's a chicken farmer down the road, and the chicken farmer's also got a big coal burner, and the chicken farmer is churning through. Now, the chicken farmer, well, cripes, when you push the cost of coal up for him, he says, oh, okay, this doesn't work. So he swaps out his coal burner for solar or natural gas or whatever it is. So we're not making the decision for the chicken farmer or the capsicum grower. We're saying coal now comes at a much higher price. And for those people that are producing goods and services that the rest of us want to buy, and maybe we want to buy the capsicums, then we'll pay the price. But those who can't, those people whose goods and services are not useful enough for the rest of us to want to pay that carbon price, because remember, it's not really the capsicum grower or the chicken farmer who end up paying that price. We do as consumers, because they need to pass it on. And if we're not prepared to pay that extra price for the capsicums or the chickens, then that individual will then change their... And maybe the chicken farmer gets out of chickens and he goes somewhere else. Or maybe he goes to free-range chickens because, I mean, really, who buys battery chickens now anyway? But you can see what I'm saying is that... But the other approach, and my fear, James, is that we come along and we say, oh, it's a coal burner, we're going to have to change or get rid of both of those burners. But, we end up making perverse, irrational decisions, where if we let the individual farmers make those decisions, because the whole idea is to... And also, because at the moment we produce, about 78 million tonnes, and we capture about 20 or 30 back with forests and so forth, because with the ETS, you get paid for taking carbon out. So you get paid for growing forests. And so maybe it's my inherent trust and faith in the market. So.
James, Ronald Reagan famously said the scariest phrase around is, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. Where does society go when the trust in the government continues to decline, as we've seen that? And I think this is a question for both of you. Trust in the markets also continues to decline. The social contract is disintegrating, and it has implications across every feature of our lives, but particularly long-term complex circumstances like climate change. So for you, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. Scariest phrase to Ronald Reagan. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that trust in the government is declining for good reason. They've let us down. And trust in the market is declining for good reason too, because oligarchs, millionaires and billionaires are taking control. They've got free rein to do what they want. They're becoming the arbiters of free speech. Facebook and Twitter are becoming, and YouTube are becoming the arbiters of free speech now. And in private hands, not in the hands of the government, how it should be. So I think that's understandable. People are losing faith in free market. It's understandable people are losing faith in the government. We need to fight to take the government back, to have it working for us again. And And what I fear, to be honest with you, is that if we allow things to continue the way that they are, we are heading on a natural course towards fascism. Because the people that feel so let down, the people who have been cast aside and let to be left to suffer, the poor people who have been left out, and the people who are afraid of losing what they have in this country, are being convinced by bigots. They're being convinced to look at a different part of society and blame them instead of look at where the power really sits. And this is what we've seen throughout history. After Obama in America, it happened. He let his people down. He told them he was going to look after them, and he sold them out to the corporates. And what did they get? Trump. And here in this country, Ardern's government, Ardern's Labour Party let us down. They said that they were going to fix housing, fix the climate crisis, and end poverty. They've let us down, and now we've got a lot of people who are really upset. And I'm very afraid that those people who are upset and the people who are afraid of what they're losing are willing to be turned by racists against parts of our society and vent their frustrations on them instead of the people in power who are really harming them.
Trust in markets is also declining, and there is a connection, I think, to James' claim that this doesn't lead to good places. What do you do with the way the social contract is disintegrating, and what that means for the way we actually would circle around a government-imposed ETS trading scheme?
I don't know that trust in markets or governments necessarily going up and down. I don't have enough knowledge to comment on that, James. You might be better placed to me to comment on it. But what my suspicion is that some of the lack of faith or whatever, what people are seeing is corporations effectively being able to negotiate political power resulting in economic power. And for me, I see that a lot. I see very powerful corporations with the ability to influence the states. Part of the reasons why I'm distrustful of them. But the mood here today is the one thing we know, whether you like markets or not, or whether you feel that they're powerful, you talk about, I use Twitter, or X it is now, cost me virtually nothing. I've got a phone here that has more computing power than what they sent the man to the moon, and it's about a $400 phone. So what's that? 4 or 5 days' work. That's you imagine the amount of labour, ideas, technology, PhD hours that went into building that phone, and it's the power of the market to deliver stuff is incredible. And nobody sits there and thinks. There was no one person who designed the cell phone, the smartphone in your pocket. There was tens of thousands of self-interested people making their own decisions for their own selfish interests. And what I'm saying with the ETS is if we put the price of carbon incrementally up little by little, every one of us in our own way will make a decision and we'll have a look at a product. And if that product is a carbon-intensive product, and it goes from $7 to $13, some of us will continue to buy. Some of us will say, I don't really want that product enough to justify that $13, so I'm going to do something else. And collectively over the entire economy, it's those little tiny decisions where everybody acting in their own self-interest is just going to say, yep, I'm going to consume a little bit less carbon. So whether you trust markets or you like them or not, or even governments. I don't trust the government, but there's no doubt it's effective. When the government put us into lockdown, they put us into lockdown. Whether we trust the government or not, it works. Government works. We close the borders. Whether you trust the market or not, we know that it works. And so what I'm saying is if you want to prevent a pandemic, then the free market's probably not the right solution. You use the government and you close the borders, right? That worked. If you want to have 5 million people making micro decisions to get to an end point of reducing carbon, I'm saying the market is better at it, whether you trust it or not.
Can I just jump in 1 second? I just want to clarify quickly that I do agree with increasing the ETS, the price of carbon under the ETS. I do think that's a good idea.
Yeah, so do I.
So I don't want you to think that that because Damien's arguing that's something that I disagree with. I think it's a good idea, and I think that money can then be used to pay to support industries to change. that's what it should be used for.
We will open up to some questions from the live audience here, but before we do that, some questions that have come in from our audience online. One for you, James. Would part of the solution to net zero be the implementation of 15-minute cities? Do you think this is a reasonable way to go towards reducing consumption, which is something you've spoken about, and facilitate the government organising society in a way that makes us more efficient with lower emissions?
Well, I think that the term 15-minute cities has a lot of implications for people. I think what I would say is that we need to be able to walk and bike and bus around our cities. We need to be able to get from place to place. We need reliable, cheap or free public transport, trains that will get us for longer distances. And if the government steps in and provides these things, that will enable people to get around and not have to continue to participate in their own demise. We can have food that's grown locally. We can invest in good insulation for our homes so that we're not wasting energy. Now, these are all no-brainer ideas. They're all available with the existing technology, and they would improve the quality of our life and reduce emissions and make us more resilient to changes if they do come as well.
Do we have any questions from the audience here? So why don't we start at the front here with this young man?
Good-looking young man, I think you meant to say.
So just for our live audience, I'll just ask you to use the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you. I wondered why the team for the negative didn't refer to the obvious thing, which is that the government should not lead the fight to reach net zero, because reducing carbon doesn't make any difference to the temperature in the atmosphere in the world, according to the ice core samples going back 1 million years, which show that the temperature rises some 650 to 1650 years before the carbon dioxide rises. It's not a good goal to look at to try to reduce carbon.
I'll answer that question, and I'll answer it in two ways. One, I don't have the technical capability, you might say, but I don't have the technical capability to answer that question. That is beyond not only my knowledge set, but I have a deep suspicion that it's actually beyond my intellectual capacity of my brain to fully understand that. What I have to do as just one member of society like everybody else who doesn't have the time to study the chemistry, I have to rely on the scientific process as designed by Popper and the rest of them, that people like Charles Keeling who are doing the analysis, I have to assume that they are acting in good faith. I can accept that they've got it wrong because scientists have got it wrong before. I struggle to accept that what we are seeing is a coordinated, I'm not saying you're saying it's a conspiracy, but look at it this way. If it's true, because you have a look at some of the analysis from the Keeling curve, you're going from 400 to 1,500 parts per million. If some of the worst case scenarios are happening, and the scientists that are telling us stuff are telling us the truth, if it costs, you look at not the Sloan report, what's it? I can't remember it. The report done that said it will cost about 1 to 1.5% GDP to actually respond. That's kind of, in my mind, that's an insurance policy. If the climate scientists have got it wrong, and we move to climate zero, we're foregoing some opportunity, but we are avoiding an existential risk. So in my mind, that's the first part of that question. The other way I'd like to respond to that is there are a lot of people who, rightly or wrongly, agree with this gentleman's position. And my concern is this. You go and you look at some of the climate change agenda and the things that people are pushing. We are talking, it's about, hey, it's not, some of what James Shaw is saying, we've got to transition in a Matinga Māori in an indigenous fashion, and we've got to make sure that it's done in a way that's equitable and all of this sort of stuff. There's a whole lot of political stuff that's been tapped onto the climate agenda. And when the scientists said, we have a problem with ozone and CFCs are killing the ozone layer, I don't know what a CFC is. I don't know what the ozone hole layer is. But I trust the people giving me the information are not lying to me, and they're telling me, right, we need to swap out from CFCs to, awkwardly, CO2 for refrigeration, right? Now I'm being told CO2 is a problem, and part of that solution is we need to introduce more equity and we had to have all of these other political things. And my concern is by doing that, we are giving people a reason to go down the rabbit hole. Let's just look at the CO2 and nothing else. Because if we do that, you ask me, and lots of people like me, climate change or socialism? Some of us are going to choose climate change. So I actually think that it's a real problem that we on the conservative right and libertarian side of the agenda, we have failed because we have allowed the political left to capture this ideology, the science, and wrap all of this other stuff around it. And I would like to pull carbon out of that and say we need to deal with carbon and let social equity as another issue.
James, you are arguing that the government should lead the fight to net zero. If the government is going to be leading that fight, how do you stop it becoming politicised and a host of other ideological issues being attached to it, as Damien is claiming?
Well, you make common sense changes that help everybody to reduce our emissions. It's not complicated, it's not rocket science. The technology that we need is all already there, and it does require some government investment. I mean, that the government's the only organisation that has the capability to coordinate the different pieces that need to be done, to invest in large-scale changes, and to support people when those changes come in. And they're also the ones that need to make the regulatory changes, the market-based changes that you're talking about as well. So that's them leading the change also.
We have time for one more question before we move to closing statements. One of these gentlemen here.
The answer to this may well be neither of you, but I'm going to ask a question. Which of you understands that this is not the question, that carbon is merely the exhaust of our frenzied energy burn, which we've used to increase our population to an overpopulated point on this planet? We're a species in overshoot. This is merely the exhaust pipe. And you can't measure it by market forces because no dollar is underwritten without energy backing it, because nothing is ever produced without energy, without work being done, right? So you're measuring with the wrong thing, so you're wrong. But the question is, do either of you acknowledge that this is merely a facet of a much bigger existential problem, and that maybe our social narrative to date is not getting there, including this debate?
Damien, why don't you lead us first?
No, I am unbelievably optimistic about humanity and human beings. I've been around 57 years, and well, yeah, I think when I was born there was about 3, and there's now 8. It's yeah, but so to be fair, the curve is actually slowing, right? I mean, in a lot of the wealthy countries, we're now at actually below replacement levels, as we're seeing in Japan. So it's possible that we're actually self-regulating. I mean, my grandparents, who grew up in Ashburton, they had 12 children, 8 survived. My parents had 5. Well, my father had 5, mother had 4, it's not a story. I've had 1. I mean, and I'm not atypical, right? So I think we are self-regulating. James, how are you going? What's your contribution to the population?
Thank you. Imagine there's a sealed jar, right, and inside it is some water with sugar in it, and you drop one bacteria in that jar. And every minute, the bacteria doubles, right? So after 1 minute, there's 2, then there's 4, then 8, then 16, 32, 64. Now, at midday, 12 o'clock, the jar's full, and at 12:01, All the bacteria are dead because they've run out of food. What time is it when the jar's half full of bacteria? Yeah, 1 minute to 12. That's where we are right now. 1 minute to 12. Now, at a minute to 12, the jar's half full, and some of the bacteria are saying, holy shit, guys, we better get our shit together because we're about to run out of food. We're about to, in 1 more minute, this jar's going to be full and it's all going to be over. But most of the bacteria are saying, chill out, man, don't worry about it. Everything's fine. You're killing my buzz here. That's the situation that we're in today. Okay? Now, it's not about...
I'm sorry, sir. We've got a lot of people watching online, and they can't hear you at the moment. And we're live on television, and we're running out of time. James, we'll let you finish, but please come up and have that comment
I'd love
shortly.
to talk after.
The comment is not only is this talk out of time, but the world is out of time.
Now,
James, we'll let you finish.
In my example, I'm not actually talking about population control. I'm talking about consumption, because countries like ours consume far more than our fair share. If everybody in the world lived like the average New Zealander, we'd need 4 planet Earths. Based on our consumption of natural resources, we only have 1. Okay? And now, population, of course, will be an issue if it continues to grow at a rate and keeps expanding. Yes, it will become an issue. But right now, the issue is consumption, because it's the rich countries that are consuming. The poor countries are not the problem here. If we need population control, it's the rich countries that need their populations controlled, because the poor ones are not consuming much at all.
We'll now go into closing statements in reverse order to what we started with. Damien, you have 5 minutes.
Look, when it comes to humanity, I remain enormously optimistic, and I don't think there has been a problem that we have been unable to solve. The ozone layer, I think, is the most relevant example to our current scenario. The ozone hole was in some ways relatively simple, because it was something that governments could, and I think in a way that James would have appreciated. And the government just said, look, we're going to stop it, because it's very discreet, we know where it comes from, we can control it, we can regulate it, we can stop it. Carbon is not like that. Carbon is much more ubiquitous. And in order to bring the carbon consumption down, we're going to need 2 things. We're going to need a regulatory regime that is simple, and that people understand and it works. And the second thing is we're going to have a regime that people will fundamentally support. And with a carbon priced system, the cost of moving from a carbon intensive economy to a net zero, which we're going to do between now and 2050 if we stick to the Paris Agreement, that cost is going to be borne predominantly by those people who are using a lot of carbon, for which the rest of us, the consumers, are not deriving a particular value for. I was talking about the capsicum grower. The capsicum grower is churning through a lot of carbon, a lot of coal, and we don't value his output enough to pay for it, then he's going to stop doing that. He's going to either change his energy supply because it gets too much, or he's going to change from capsicums to something else. The solution that James is putting forward, and I may misquote you and you can correct me, James wants to have a much more top-down environment where the state says, okay, there is socially acceptable behaviour where you need a social licence to do this, and there is socially unacceptable behaviour. Now, I'm not going to disagree, James, that that can be achieved. We can totally use the power of the state to reduce the level of carbon consumption. But in order to do that, we need to violate the political and economic rights of so many individuals. And as a consequence of that, 2 things are going to happen. 1, we're going to get negative economic outlets. And 2, we're going to have people suddenly say, hey, it's only 500 parts per million, you know? Is that really 100 parts per million? Is it really that much? And there's a lot of Alex Jones type stuff out there. If you don't want to believe in the climate science, because you don't like what the government is doing, stopping you getting your trusses for your shed, for your motorboat, there is a wealth of opportunity for you not to believe. The one beautiful thing about an emissions trading scheme is it allows every one of us to make our own individual decisions about our activity. And if we're doing stuff that uses a lot of carbon, but it's really important for us, because maybe we need to go to this particular town or we need to do this thing, it's really important and we're prepared to pay the price, then we'll pay the price. But if it's not that important to us and the price goes up, we will choose to do something else. And it's something that I believe is far more likely to get political support. And the killer app, I think, for New Zealand is if we make the emission trading scheme work in the same way as we made women's suffrage work. This is a scheme that could be exported around the world.
Thank you, Damien. Just a reminder, as we come into these closing statements, if you would like to re-vote, we are seeing some interesting polling coming through, a winner emerging at this stage. James, 5 minutes for you.
Thanks. What Damien's forgetting about is the carrot and the stick. So he's talking about the fact that the prices of emissions could go up, but what happens to the money that people pay? What I'm suggesting is we need to invest that money. Farmers need support to transition to regenerative, to genuinely regenerative farming practices. Businesses, capsicum growers need support to move away from capsicums out of season and to grow something in season in the winter months. People need support to do this because the economic system that we're in means that our growers and our farmers and our businesses are mortgaged up to the hilt. And so making the changes that he's talking about will really harm them, and we need to take that into account. What guides those decisions is the needs of our population. That's what we should be putting first, the needs of our people. And during my opening statements, I explained why the solution is worse than you probably think and how we are in a collective state of denial. I explained how our government is betraying us to a future in which our survival is in peril. Finally, I explained why the government, despite its shortcomings, must be the body which leads the fight to achieving net zero. But given the problems with our political and economic system, this will not happen while big money interests continue to influence our government. This is not a new phenomenon. For hundreds of years, peaceful civil resistance has been an essential part of a functioning democracy. In New Zealand, we took to the streets and seas to stop nuclear ships coming into our waters, and we sent a message to the world. We rallied against the Springbok tour, forcing our government to uphold its commitment to boycott international sports with the apartheid South African regime. We were the first country to give women the vote. And how did that happen? It's because they demanded it. It's because they took the kinds of disruptive action that people like me are taking today. Even things we take for granted, like the 8-hour working day and weekends, were not won by asking nicely. They happened because of collective workers' action, which disrupted the operation of the companies they worked for. Today, you and I now have a duty to engage in civil resistance if we want to have any hope of avoiding the worst effects of climate change. Humans have an incredible ability to change their thinking to suit their needs. We see this in survivors of abuse. We see this in sports people who control their minds in order to perform at their best. What we are ultimately facing is the need to change our thinking if we wish to survive as a species. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Humans have been here maybe 300,000 years. Agriculture, about 8,000 years. The study of economics, about 300 years. And the aeroplane for just over 100. We can change how we think in order to change the way that we live and preserve the natural world, or we can pretend that the economy is bigger than the planet. We're at a crossroads now, with human extinction a real possibility. Will we be the generation that throws away 300,000 years of human evolution? Or will we do what it takes, whatever it takes, to preserve life on this precious little blue-green ball? We have the potential to explore space, the depths of the oceans, the microorganisms that live in the soil. We have the potential to develop truly open and free societies where human expression can flourish and the deep questions of life can be investigated. But none of this will be possible if we allow our leaders to continue to take us down an ideological path of self-destruction. Governments must lead the fight to reach net zero, but they won't unless someone like you takes a stand. Find your place in the growing community of movements calling for radical change to reduce overconsumption of this planet and restore the natural world. Join them. We owe it to our ancestors. We owe it to our descendants not to pass on a world in peril. So I'm calling on you here now in the audience, you people at home watching on TV or streaming, please get involved and join a group taking peaceful civil resistance. Sign up for non-violent direct action training. Join them on the streets, shut down the machine which is killing us, and demand that the government takes bold climate action now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
I love your passion, James. I don't agree with it, but I love it.
The results are very tight. This is intriguing, and they're still coming in. So just while we come to the final comments of this, before we announce the winners of this debate, gentlemen, with the view of persuasion and the reason of dialogue in mind, I wonder if you could briefly make a comment to the most persuasive or the strongest argument that your opponent has made tonight that has caused you the most pause for reflection. What do you think was telling in the arguments that you heard from your opponent?
The one I liked, and I'm kicking myself because I didn't think that, but talking about the Springboks and the power of individual action, and I actually agree with James on this. I think part of the reason why the climate issue is to the fore, and whilst I don't necessarily agree with James's prescriptions, I think that the activity of people like Charles Keeling and James Cockle and others that have brought this to the issue, this is not something, and credit to James, that would have necessarily come to the surface on its own. I think there have been multiple generations, and I think James is part of a proud tradition, so I'll take my hat off to him for that.
Thank you. Thanks. And for me, it was the description of the way that the market forces can help to change behaviours. You know, I do see the value in that, and yeah, I really appreciated the way that you described that to us.
Very good. We're just having our final results tallied. We had a very willing crowd to change their minds. Despite stronger support coming into this for Damien's position, people came in with a willingness to change their minds, and I'm glad to see that in a group. But James comes out on top with 2% more support than Damien, having changed their mind. So our winner for this evening, James Cockle. That was like watching a game of tennis rather than anything else, though, with it going back and forth. So thank you for those online, watching on our social media, and, of course, those here tonight at St. David's Lecture Theatre at Otago University for participating in that. While we may have agreed or disagreed with the contributions that have been made by Damien and James tonight, hopefully we have each benefited and learned from hearing this clash of ideas. We're very pleased with the turnout and response we've had to this, our first debate in this lecture series, and we hope that you'll tune in, even if you can't join us in Wellington or in Hamilton or in Auckland, for what will undoubtedly be even more spicier events in the weeks to come. Thanks again to our participants.